Sweet. Hey guys. So maybe 4 or 5 months ago, I think, before the summer, I gave a lightning talk on Famous, and that was right as they were rolling out their public beta. Um, and at that point, all anybody really knew was like the periodic table demo that they had on their website, where the thing, moved from sphere to helix to the periodic table, and it sort of had this nice transitions, and everyone wanted to know what it was. They promised a lot of pretty amazing stuff. There was a lot of grand claims in terms of, this was going to be what delivered HTML5 and its performance, so that people could use it for better mobile app development or any number of things. So I went out in May to HTML5 Dev Conference and had sort of like first-hand training with the Famous core team, and was at the hackathon there. And that was really overwhelming, but super informative, and I think it was. There's a lot of people doing a lot of different things, a lot of people expecting a lot of different things from the framework. I feel like Famous probably has been more dramatic than a lot of other JavaScript frameworks, right? It's not like back when where it's just like Jeremy and he's making this thing. That's kind of it. This is like a startup. They have funding and they have an agenda, right? So there's sort of a different vibe, but it's super exciting, and I think that they've done some really cool things. So. I don't know how many people here are. I expect most of you are developers, for the most part. Yeah. Okay. And are you guys front-end developers? Who's JavaScript, HTML, CSS friendly? Right. Cool. And has anyone done any work with Famous? A little bit. Okay. A little bit. Cool. So has anyone done work? Has anyone used require or AMD sort of JavaScript module definitions in their JavaScript patterns?
Client or server side?
Client side. But I'm sure on the servers is same idea. Okay, so I just want to kind of get out the way because I want to know where to start. I think I'm just going to start from the beginning here.
If you pull that map, just do that.
Okay, so. This is supposed to be a deep dive, so I think I'm going to start from where you would start a project, right, and kind of go through creation instead of just talking generally about the things. So if you go to the Famous GitHub Famous, they give you this situation here. So who's familiar with Node and Node Package Manager? Okay, great. So for those of you that aren't familiar, Node Package Manager is a command line tool that's going to go out and find what you're looking for, find its dependencies, install it on your machine in the appropriate directories, hopefully. It's a great tool. And who's familiar with Yeoman? Great. So for those who don't know, Yeoman is a Node module that works with Bower and Grunt and Yo, you have its own thing, to scaffold projects and then use those package managers to go get the dependencies, right? So luckily Famous built a Yeoman generator. So what you would do is you make sure that you have Node and NPM in your path, and then you'd want to get the Famous generator, so you'd NPM install Famous generator on the global level there, and then go from there. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm gonna go into some directory which has a bunch of projects, right? And we're gonna create a directory. Okay, I'm going to go in there. and call you famous. And just so I kind of want to start from the beginning here, so everyone kind of gets the idea. I don't want to skip anything, because no one skips things when I'm watching whatever. I'm kind of annoyed. I want to know what's going on. There we go. All right. This Yeoman's going to prompt you with some questions. You need project name here, sure. Project description. No, that's cool. Okay. So, luckily, all this stuff is already cached because I just did this. So it's going a lot faster than you hadn't done this before. And it's going to go, you can see it got, we created a lot of files for the project. It's Bower installing a bunch of stuff, getting some polyfills. So while this kind of cooks on here, I want to know from you guys sort of what about Famous is interesting to you, so I can focus. There's a lot to talk about. Does anyone have just no?
For me, it's performance.
Performance, okay.
I guess how it really changes the UI paradigm.
Okay.
Yeah, differences from existing JS frameworks and why you would want, under what scenario would you choose Famous over something else?
Okay, cool.
Yeah, basic stuff.
Okay. So, we're going to wait for a minute while this goes. Actually, while this goes, I'm going to show these slides, which are provided by the Famous people. So in case I'm missing anything or I'm glossing over anything, I want to make sure I touch on these things. Let's go through those. Right, so this is the situation, right? HTML5, right? Woo! But not too much. And so, right, the problems rendering and animation. So the DOM is awful, right? Whoever's been doing, front-end development for a while, jQuery was great for a little bit when everything was static, rendered server-side, and all you're doing is changing classes, maybe moving things around a little bit. But then things got more complicated, and mobile showed up, and mobile doesn't perform as well as desktop, and there's all these performance issues with the DOM, and just kind of sucks, DOM sucks. Everyone is familiar with those pain problems. And the animations that we can kind of do with the DOM are, we can slide the height of something or change the opacity. It's not all that exciting. Right, so, yes, very good. We want native apps. That's true. Yeah, so we got CSS3. And CSS3 is great, but it's super declarative. So it's not composable, and it's not doesn't react to things very well. It's very static. So JavaScript, obviously being the language of the browser, is going to be sort of where this goes on. So Famous has written the rendering engine in JavaScript, right? So the paradigm before was the HTML, it was like the DOM box model. Divs and divs and divs and divs, and there's sort of like this. Oh, there's a great example. I'd love to show kind of what's going on. That. So let's go to any popular site. What kind of a site would we like to visit? What, Reddit? Anybody? Go there.
Twitter, Reddit.
Twitter? Let's go to Reddit. Okay? And here's Reddit. And then we're gonna... There it is. Hold on. HTML entries. It used to be They changed this all around. They always do that to you.
Doing good.
Well, anywho, this is a great example. Anyway, this is the image. The Firefox 3D guy would sort of extrude out any divs that were in the thing, in the DOM, and you get this huge stack, right? So this is the old model, and everything is relative to its parent. And that causes a lot of performance issues because when you affect anything within a series of nested divs or the parent of some nested divs, all the other items are sort of necessarily affected. And so you have all sorts of unwanted and unneeded repaints and reflows, and it's super kludgy and very slow. And that's one of the problems. We were talking about paradigm shifts. Someone was asking about what's the paradigm shift between this and that. One of the big ones is that in Famous, you're not writing any HTML, and so you're not nesting anything, and you end up with, for the most part, a completely flat HTML structure, right? So everything is a sibling, and everything is positioned absolutely, okay? And then where the relative positioning of elements are is held in JavaScript, in the JavaScript memories, right? So the render tree is no longer it's in the DOM, it's in sort of some map in the JavaScript world, right? So that's a really big difference in box model rendering and DOM rendering and sort of what Famous is trying to do, right? So it's very ominous. All right. How's our guy going? This is not a good sign. So I'm gonna abort this. So eventually it will install Famous for you. And let's see here. Let's go with alright, well, not doing what we wanted to do at all. Let's just fall back to dive. So I was working today to put together a demo. Alright. Let's get where we want it to be, which is to talk about code. So first of all, what Famous gives you out of the box is basically this folder structure, and you're going to get an HTML file here, which is gonna. This is sort of a yeoman setup. It's set up with grunt. So what's that?
Yeah.
This is just the HTML file that the yeoman generator is going to pump out. It's going to load some polyfills. And it's going to load require.js, and it's going to point to require config. And this is going to set up some paths for things like that. And it's also going to load main.js, and this is sort of where all things kind of kick off, right? So let's get in here. This syntax here is, I think it's like the common syntax for loading asynchronous modules. Some of the things that are pretty much going to be in every famous module that you're going to write are going to be like modifier, transform, surfaces, things like that. So let's get smaller and look at the view. Okay. So famous also, the Yeoman generator also has commands for generating views, and that'll print out a scaffold that looks pretty much like this, minus all of the business that's in here. So basically what you get is it's going to include view, surface transform, and it's going to sort of do the classic vanilla JavaScript class extending syntax, right? So a lot of libraries wrap this up, like Backbone wraps this up, and Ember, and so you get that keyword extend, and you can extend from one class to the next. Famous is doing that for you, so you're left sort of like a little bit of boilerplate here. I think that in the future that'll probably get dealt with, but that's just my own opinion about that, because I don't think people want to write this every time they create a new class. So what it's asking for in here is a surface. So let's back out to here, and we're going to do something pretty crazy. And we're going to start from the beginning. Okay. Logo. Okay. So like there's some really simple components here, so I just want to talk about some simple components. Surface is like base level. Surface is basically like the base level display element. You can give it, in this case, it's giving it a size dimension. This is actually an image surface. So a regular surface might look like so this is going to create a div, basically, right? And it's going to be a surface. It's going to be super dumb. It's not going to know where it is, where it should be, its size, or anything like that, right? It's just going to be a super flat object, and there's not much to it. And then you can pass it size parameters, so you can tell it this is generally in pixels, right? You can tell it's going to be 200 pixels by 200 pixels. You can give it content. You can give it this. This is going to put a CSS class on it, so you can style it in CSS. But what's really interesting is that this is going to demonstrate the render tree. So this is a modifier here, and you see in the context it adds the modifier and then logo, which is the surface, right? And that creates a direct relationship, and the relationship is created by the sequence in which you call add on a render node. Okay, so a render node is abstractly just a it's like the most low-level idea of like this thing is rendered on the DOM, right? So in this case, main context, which is the main context or the scene graph that you're working in, that's the bottom line, and it's adding a modifier, and then it's adding a surface, and as such, because of that sequence, the surface is directly related to the modifier. Now, in this case, the modifier has an origin of 0.5, 0.5, and that puts it in the center. And has the size on the surface. Now, what you can do, and generally this is what sort of how I've been working with this, is I'll put the size on the modifier, and that'll have the same effect as having the size on the surface, right? Because the modifier is in charge of the surface. So from what I've seen so far working with this, it seems best to keep in charge of even the size in the modifiers and let surfaces be just super dumb. So let's play around with this and kind of see what happens. So if we set this to 1 and 1, the origin point of the modifier, it's going to throw that guy down in the corner there. Floating around down there. And so what's really interesting is where it's rotating around, right? So before it was rotating around the center of the surface, but now it's rotating around this right point, and that's because I set the origin point to 1. This is going to throw it back This is going to throw it back in the middle, and it's going to also rotate around that center point, right? And if I set this to 0, it's going to be on the left side, and it's going to rotate around that. So origin not only controls sort of where it is in the context of its parent render node, but also where any 3D transform rotates are going to happen around, right? So if you're going to be rotating things on Z or X, that's kind of where that's going to go down. Yeah.
Is that always tied together? I mean, it seems like a limitation.
Well, okay, you can have multiple modifiers, right? So, and that's where you kind of end up with modifiers which are very scoped to specific things. Like this is my origin modifier. This is my this is my transform modifier. This is my size modifier. And then whatever you need to manipulate, however you need to manipulate the thing, you're going to manipulate those individual modifiers. So that's kind of. Now, a lot of times your layouts are simple and you don't need to have all those modifiers, but certainly the flexibility is there for that.
Just a quick question on the size option. Is that always pixels, or do you have other options there?
I think if you pass in a string, you can pass in like 15%. That seemed like it broke it, so maybe not. Yeah. There you go. Okay, so the next piece of this modifier is this transform function, the transform property here, and that takes a few different options. One of which is a function that returns a transform. That's a lot of famous jargon. But the idea here, and I'm going to try to illustrate this best I can, is that famous is essentially updating the scene graph every tick of request animation frame. So at its lowest level, it's asking the browser when it should change the scene graph, right? Request animation frame is a JavaScript API that basically fires in a loop indefinitely. And what famous is doing is it's multiplying all the matrices of its different surfaces and where they should be, and then every tick of the animation frame from the browser API, it's updating that, right? So that's where it's getting its performance. There's been blog posts going back a few years now talking about request animation frame and how to optimize your specific animation using request animation frame. And certainly, I've done that. Other people have done that in like specific contexts. But I feel like this is maybe one of the first times that we've seen it at the core of a library, right? Where the entirety of everything that's being rendered is based on that concept. So because of that, you can think of this as a very reactive framework because it's always querying where things should be, right? So we see this thing is spinning around. Why is it spinning in circles, right? So what's interesting here is if the transform is asking from the date now method, right? And because it's happening every tick of request animation frame, date now is always going to be different. It's doing a little bit of math to figure out kind of to kludge things together here a little bit, but you can see that because time is indefinitely moving, that's why it's this like constant rotating object here. And from that you can extrapolate a lot. You can have so let's take away this and look at. So there's the transform that you can pass in sort of as in the instantiation of the modifier object, and then there's you can do transform from. So another super important object in Famous is this thing called a transitionable. Deep dive the Famous. What is this? Living core? No, I didn't like where that was. Transitions. Sorry. Okay, cool. Okay. So, let's do this a little bit easier. So opacity is, usually sort of between 0 and 1, right? And we're going to okay, transitionable will take an integer or an array, okay, and then it will transition any of the items in the array or the integer between what you set it as and the curve you pass it, right? So right now this is hopefully going to make my thing invisible because it'll have a transparency of 0. Excellent. Okay. So the center modifier, or this modifier, is getting its opacity from this transitionable, right, using this transitionable get method. Transitionable is set to 0. So this transitionable is pretty, doesn't really know what's going on, doesn't know its opacity, its size, its translate, it's just an integer, right? So I can go ahead and I can call this set method on this, and I think that set yeah, and a state transition number. We're going to set this to 1, and we're going to pass in the what are they calling it? They're calling it the transition. Okay, so a transition object has the duration. So we'll give it a nice long 3-second duration, and the curve, which In this case, I'm not going to pass anything in because the default curve is linear. So we should see happen is this thing slowly fade in, right? Perfect. So this is a really important concept here. These opacity from, transform from on the modifiers, right? You can pass them these transitionables, and then you can affect these transitionables anywhere you want on any kind of curve, and then the scene graph is going to react to that and update accordingly. So that's, I think, that's like at the core of how Famous wants you to animate things. It wants you to abstract out the transitionables, the modifiers, and the surfaces. And then you're gonna create the render tree with modifiers and surfaces. The modifiers are gonna have reference to these transitionables, and you're gonna modify them based on events or what have you. So yeah, I think that's a good explanation of how that's all put together. So let's talk about how you would use that. So that's all like really low level Famous core stuff, right? Like it would take forever to build an app if all you're doing is like surfaces and modifiers and transitionables. I mean, before all you had to do was throw some divs together and put some CSS and you get a layout, right? I mean, it seems like we've gone back a little bit. So that's a problem. Now Famous offers what they call views. Try to back up in time here because I'm completely shredded my demo here.
We're just playing the video in reverse right now.
Yeah, alright. Alright, let's go back to... When did I start talking?
6:45.
6:45. All right, that looks safe right there. Well, beans. So there's our list. Okay. So we kind of come out of the weeds a little bit. So now at the top level, I'm asking for...
Can you zoom in on the font again?
Font again. Okay. So here, I still have my main context. I'm no longer adding a modifier here in the beginning because if I were to do that, the center spin modifier, what do you think is going to happen here?
Linear list.
We're going to get a spinning list. We don't need this origin here. That's kind of wonky.
A quick question as a non-developer point of view. Looks like an XY axis, yet your axis is also your origin of spin of your transform.
What's that?
The X part of that is both the X and the origin of spin?
Yes.
Origin of the transform?
Yes. So he asked the question earlier. He pointed that out.
Why would you want to do that?
Why would you want to do that?
It just looks like a...
Yeah.
When would that ever work?
Yeah, he pointed that out. I said you can separate those out to do different modifiers.
Yeah, use modifier to make that right.
Yeah, so we have one modifier doing this, one modifier doing that.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's not spin our list. Okay. So Famous. There is a famous Angular project that's ongoing right now. As you might imagine, Angular and Famous would be hard to do together if there wasn't someone else doing it for you, because Angular is very much in control of when things are rendering. It has its life cycle that it's doing, and all that. And Famous has got this, this core where it puts animation frame and like how do those things together. So this guy is, super smart, way smarter than any of us. I don't know, maybe smarter than, certainly smarter than me. And he put together this Famous Angular project, and at first the CEO of Famous, this is really a sort of funny story, CEO of Famous had this meetup, and he was like, if I wrote Angular, I would hate my job, right? And the community was like, oh my god, like, what on earth are you talking about? We all love Angular, and, nerds are super aggressive, so so he backed off that a little bit, and then one particular developer who was super into the Angular wrote this famous Angular integration, and now ironically enough, on the Famous homepage, they're promoting and sort of, marketing Famous Angular as the solution. Interesting, storyline there. If you were going to use another framework, another MVC, so so Famous is very much doing the rendering. They talked about having an MVC, something that they were going to come out with, like their own models, their own controllers, and things like that. That hasn't happened yet, and so people are obviously sort of using what's available now. In my opinion, the most bare metal, easiest MVC to work with is Backbone because it's really simple. It's not very opinionated. Like the models and flexions are very discrete. And they don't get in the way of anything. So this thing is put together with a Backbone model and connection talking to Sales MVC, Sales API. So running on my machine here is 404. Is this API which is spitting out some JSON, right? And I've created some simple. Nice, really simple Backbone model, right? Got some defaults in there, and then here's a collection, and it's pointing to my local host, and that's all that's going on there. So there's no wizardry or anything crazy famous going on. It's literally a Backbone model and a Backbone collection. So let's get past that. Take a look at, okay, views. So yeah, I mean, I could sit there in main.js and create like 50 modifiers and 50 surfaces, and things would get real dirty real fast, right? So Famous has this concept of views, and views essentially is a render node with an event emitter. Okay, so it's a render node. You can add things to it, and you can add it to other things. It's not actually represented in your scene graph as a div. If you add a view to anything, you won't get anything unless the view has a surface in it, right? So it's like, that's what I mean by this render node, is sort of this ethereal object that you can add to things but doesn't actually print anything out. And it has an event emitter, and so it can subscribe to things and it can pipe things and stuff like that.
What events does it emit?
Whatever you want.
Okay.
So you can emit, the beer is here, and other things can listen to the beer is here, and all that good stuff. So let's look at to-do item view. Okay, so this is what I was talking about before, where you kind of get this view generate. The Yeoman has a generator for the view, and it spits out the scaffold for this, which is basically just like the JavaScript syntax to create a class. And what I'm doing here is this thing has a default option. This is sort of a Famousism. This default options going into the classes. They've kind of written this sugar a little bit for you, so I don't want to represent it like it's native JavaScript. And in here, I'm just sort of passing in an empty Backbone model as a default option. So this view needs a Backbone model because it's going to create a surface, and it's going to get some information from the Backbone model and put it into the content of the surface. And then it's going to rely on the records done or not done, because this is the canonical to-do app, whether or not to set classes as done or not done. And that's why you're going to have green and red because it's Christmas. So here's our event emitter that I talked about, right? So each view comes with this event output emitter, and you can kind of do whatever you want. So in this case, what's going to happen is you're going to click on the surface. It's going to, I wrote some really bad logic here. It's going to check to see if it's done. There's some classes. This is a Backbone method that's going to save, so send to the API, update the server with the saved model, and then it's going to emit out the record was updated, and this is the record. Anything else can subscribe to this view, right? And so it's very decoupled in that way, and that's like a nice piece of Famous. They did a good job with the events in terms of everything has this built-in event emitter and whatnot. So So this is going to spit out a record, and then what's going to happen is the list is going to subscribe to it, and when it gets this event, it's going to do its thing, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's just some event binding going on there. And actually, I took you down sort of a bad path there because to-do item is not what's being listened to. Add to-do item is what's being listened to. So in this case, we're going to add a new item. So don't. Right, and that's gonna. It was listening to it, and it put it up there at the top. We'll just take a look at to-do or list. Where's our list? Here it is. So record input. What did it do on listening to itself? Listening to that surface, sort of emitting what happened, right? Well, it added it to the Backbone collection, and it saved the record, and that updated the API. But this is interesting. So this list of items here, which is actually a broken scroll view, because it's jumping around, it's not supposed to do that. I don't know what I did to make that happen. This scroll view is a built-in Famous component, and actually I can show you what one looks like not broken, which is right here. So if we were to so that's, it's supposed to be nice and smooth and good. I did something when I was working on this demo. See that?
Menu 1, there.
This guy?
What's that?
That's just some text that's not meant to fit in this. Here, how about we get an Android? Sorry.
That's not better.
Okay. Yay. Okay. So here's a scroll view that's not jumping around. I just want to show you that it's not the famous scroll view. It's something that I was doing when I was working on this that made it super jumpy like that. But scroll views are nice because to create a scroll view, all you have to do is instance the scroll view method from the famous core, and then call sequence from, and then pass in an array. Okay. And that array will have can have any kind, is basically an array of render nodes. It can be surfaces, it can be views, it can be other kinds of render nodes. You can pop and push things from that array, and then whatever is sequencing from that array is gonna automatically update itself, right? So the scroll view was sequenced from that array. So as I add things and remove things from that array, the scroll view is gonna update itself to have more or less of those items, right? So that's sort of the crux of the To-Do app is, you have this thing that's scroll view sequencing from the those views that I created, and then whenever I can unbreak this, I can add an item to this. It pushes that sort of newly created view, which is the to-do view, onto that array, and the scroll view updates, and Bob's your uncle, right? So so we're a little bit out of surfaces and modifiers, and a little bit into now we're building like more complex views, right? So that's sort of like a pretty straightforward app there. Okay, I want to talk about a problem we ran into. I worked for a company in New York called Lukesoft, just like an agency. They're really nice guys. Yeah. And we ran into a problem with routing. Okay, this looks super busted on the small screen, but bear with me. So there's no router built into Famous, right? There's just like these event emitters. But in a website, you are sort of used to URLs and the push state and all that, right? So how is Famous going to work with push state and URLs? That was a question we had, and we wanted to figure that out. So we built this thing called Event Router. And this is built off of the Backbone router, okay? So if you're familiar with Backbone, but you can do this with any router, I think. So this is just JavaScript module that asks for backbone and asks for event emitter, which is a famous class, which, as you might imagine, emits events. And what we do is we extend the backbone router, we create the routes, and then whenever anyone hits the routes, we throw out a navigation event, which is this navigate to page event, and then the URL, right? And so that way we can couple what's happening sort of at the event broadcast layer with what's happening at the URL level. And this is sort of like a simple little class, but it really kind of helped us out because now you can go like this and you can hit the back button because it's the router, and that's emitting this navigate to page about us. Everything is listening for that, and then the about us components are going to say, oh, it's our turn, and we're going to come in and be on the scene graph, right? Here's another scroll view, but with transform from set on the, what's the name of that method? The output from. So scroll view output from, you return a transform move then, and what that does is as you're scrolling, it's gonna, in this case, it's gonna rotate around the x-axis. What's that?
With an offset.
With an offset, right, exactly. So here you're gonna get things that, basically just move as you're defining them in that function, and you're gonna get a helix. So scroll view, which sort of initially started off as, oh, it's just like sequencing from this array. There's a lot of juice in scroll view, and there are some problems with it, but I think they're flushing them out. We just saw a bug pop up that I haven't seen before, so that's clear. Now I want to show something else, and that's that. So what's funny is when I'm spinning around this helix here, here's me on one side, but there's some text on the other. So these items that are in the scroll view now, because I said that you can sequence from not just surfaces, but any type of render node. This is sequencing from a view, a famous view called a flipper, right? And the flipper has two sides, and as you might imagine, it flips, right? So here we're putting some famous components together, right? So we have the scroll view, we're sequencing the scroll view from flippers, and then we have flippers. We're clicking on the flipper and flipping the flipper. And I think that's a pretty cool effect with not a whole lot of code, right? So I think we're seeing a little bit of the excitement here with the famous.
So with those location changes, was it writing it up to the location?
Oh, you want to see this? If I can get a handle on one of these guys. Okay. So this is what's going on in the div area, right? And if you take a look at here, one of these divs, let's take it put this div right here. Yeah, image surfaces that. What's positioning it is this WebKit matrix 3D, right? So it's using. Remember I said everything's positioned absolute. It's not using top or left, or even translate XYZ. It's using matrix 3D, which is the entirety of any sort of layout, right, for an object. It's X, Y, Z, Y position, X position, Y position, Z position, rotate, skew, all of those things. And like again, I said before, down in the core, it's using request animation frame, which is updating these matrices on a request animation frame. So it's not doing a whole lot of operation and getting a whole lot of layout as a result, right? So that's a great question.
Are there any performance impacts to that refresh rate? I mean,
So let's take
that's looking at a lot of data.
Let's take a look at what we got going on there. Alright. So this thing is doing pretty good,
Yeah.
I'd say.
That particles when we had it.
Oh yeah, particles. Good.
So Byron, one of the consequences, though, potentially, is if you had something that was computationally intensive going up in the background, that animation's gonna suffer.
Yeah, yeah. JavaScript, Achilles heel, single thread, right? It's only can do what it can do. Now there's a little bit of light with web workers and things like that, so you can offload some of that computation away from what's doing the rendering. Yeah, I mean that's definitely something if you're doing I don't know, a bunch of D3 computation or something, with Famous at the same time, you're gonna run into some problems. I think that what they said was you can get about 500 surfaces in DOM animating at the same time and still be okay with that 60 frames per second rate, which is a shit ton of DOM at that.
More than you want to do.
More than you want to do.
Is that a technical term?
So, and then what's on the horizon with them, hopefully, is that the same API is going to print to WebGL, right? So that's the other thing that they're promising. That's millions of services or whatever. And there's, from the Famous Labs people, you can see the videos and whatnot. They're demoing, shaders, and so they're writing shaders for these things and getting pretty thick that way. But I don't think the public has sort of seen any of that stuff yet. I want to talk about a sort of layout decision that we made, what we call global transform. Again, I don't know if any of this is sort of in the guidelines of how Famous wants you to use this. I don't think they really care, to be honest. I think they just want people to use it. So here's a bunch of surfaces, and the surfaces have sort of within confines random positions on the screen, right? And then when we're going to click on them, we're going to take the inverse of that and set that inverse to the root modifier of the scene graph. And what that's going to do is going to zoom that to the center of the scene graph, right? And then we're just going to sort of go through these, and you get this kind of neat effect, right? We need to do that kind of thing, right? So that was sort of there's actually a developer, a friend of mine, Ian, who came up with this concept. But I think it's a really great concept because from that you can go to. So here's the same idea, right? Where instead of random things in space, which isn't all that useful, we sort of have a menu, right? And we're gonna zoom to a specific spot on the menu. And just go through it that way. And so now we have something a little bit more concrete using that same layout pattern. And then we use that for this sort of larger idea concept site, right? Which is we're just so global transform is literally just moving these menu items to, it's taking the inverse and putting them where they need to be. And sort of you have that idea of a site there. And then we sort of went even further with that in that, so this is using the same math just on a specific view. So then you can move that view around on that same idea of taking the inverse of the specific surface, right? Location.
It's funny with me because I don't remember when the first time that what's the vector renderer program? I don't even remember what it is anymore. Steve Jobs hates.
Flash.
Flash.
Oh, Flash.
Flash first came out. This is back in '98.
Yeah.
I got a resume from someone who was just using it for the web. Of course, you had to download the plugins.
Yeah.
It was limited. And the site did a lot of these things, but it had to use, of course, a window with Flash. But these were the same kind of demos. That's why when I saw Famous, I was kind of excited because I missed that because Flash kind of went away from doing that to just doing movies and stuff.
Yeah.
Instead of real vector navigation.
Yeah, I think mobile really killed Flash. Absolutely. And I think that's I think that mobile's kind of trying to kill HTML5 a little bit too, right? I think things are having trouble in that space, and that's why we're seeing these bits show up, right? Yeah. So I don't know if there's anything. Oh yeah, this is just sort of something super shiny. Look, we have our router that we just can't get out of. Okay. And that Famous has a physics engine. Woo! On top of it, right? So these are just surfaces, and the surfaces have mass, which is relative to the size of the surface. And then the mouse also has sort of a hidden surface underneath it. And then there's a little bit of collisions going on there, right? And you can this is just sort of like poking around with the physics engine. And there's some walls on the sides of the windows, basically. And then when the surfaces get to the end, they're just kind of being recycled over there in the beginning. Go around and around and around. One of the other things I should say is that Famous makes it really hard to take things off of the DOM, right? So actually, you can't really do that directly. Like you can't call surface remove like you might expect, right? Like I said before, like so scroll views, sequence from, and a lot of other rendering objects have that same idea where they're picking up information from arrays or whatnot. And I think that's because taking things and adding them to the DOM is expensive, right? And that's another performance problem. So if you, the developer, is just like ripping things out of the DOM, their 60 frames per second goes out the window, right? So that's why what made me think of that is this: we're not taking the surfaces out of here; we're just putting them back to the other side of the screen because taking them out of the DOM is hard.
So what's a prescribed method for dealing with the surface?
Just hide it.
None?
Yeah, translate it some, off screen somewhere.
Hide it, put it in your recycle bin.
Put it,
when
yeah.
you need another one, then
Yeah. I think, right, and I think that's a great pattern to think about too, right? Like we're so used to being like destroy and make a new one, and that's sort of I don't know, not green. I don't know, like.
Electrons don't come cheap, buddy.
Yeah, of course there's Silicon Valley and they made this, right? Yeah. No. Yeah, so I think that's a great paradigm to think about is like how to reuse your surfaces. Yeah, as something that's sort of a result of trying to do super performance.
What else is interesting about this is like, it's interesting for me because I used to do flight simulators.
Okay.
Of course, you used to draw the transform, doing 3D stuff.
Yeah.
But also the physics modeling, and the idea of having one thing attached to a universe of relative things.
Yeah.
You might have an airplane with the wings. Well, that's one model that's then attached to other models that move relatively to the world, so you rotate it, they all rotate.
Yep.
So those models are not silly for doing, especially animation.
They're not.
They're made for, but it's not like you can just transform the entire internet famous either. I mean, there's a place for a static, and they're being really good about that since the beginning.
Yeah.
Of saying this is what we do, which is when you need this mobile-like interface that's very responsive, that gravity feel that Apple made so famous now, which I love because it's, once again, it's a physics model.
Yep.
That's what it seems to do really well.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's definitely their play. Absolutely. Obviously, filling out a form for your healthcare in a cube doesn't do anybody any good.
Can you throw it through the window?
But there is a lot of this is what I've been thinking about with Famous. What I'm planning on look at it more. There's a lot of things where you want to do a user interface thing for the user that's beyond what HTML5 offers you, or even native, really.
Yeah.
Native really only offers you the same freaking full net. Sometimes you're doing something like with words or other things, like still, I want to, not like drag and click or something, but something unique. I mean, people forgot that every application is a unique challenge. We were limited in HTML5, and even on native, it's not easy to program something from scratch.
And native doesn't do 3D. Like, well,
and it doesn't have an elegant scripting like approach. You still have to brute force it like you're from scratch.
Yeah.
What I like about Famous is they have their paradigm, which is very much like anyone that does a flight sim is used to. It's all relative, and I don't think it's as unapproachable as they think. You're starting to bring in these other things like Backbone, which is good for, I think, adoptability.
Yeah.
But you can really get in there if you understand the relative approach. We're used to that from divs, right? People get the fact that a div inside another div. They don't go like, well, what do you mean? I don't get it.
Yeah.
I think that what's hard for them is people getting used to the idea of how we used to treat things like in flights in the old days before there was an internet. Everything was like this. Everything was coordinates. It's not as hard as it sounds.
No, yeah, and I think that the guys who when I met, I think the guys in the core team are people from the gaming industry and people who are used to working in matrices and doing that kind of vector math. I think HTML developers are scared of that, and so I think it's good that they're wrapping that up for them. But certainly they're exposing a lower level where you can get in and make with the shiny.
Well, that's what I liked about the documentation. It didn't hide the fact that these are actually matrix things going on. But you don't have to do anything with them. They built those libraries. I was almost thinking one day, wouldn't it be cool to do kind of like what they're doing, build the matrix, build 3D stuff. But it's a lot of work. They've done that in a way that you're leveraging it. But they don't hide the fact that this isn't just you can move, like it's not like Logo. Remember in the old days where you move this over here? You still get that low level type of feeling without it being overwhelming. At least when I first looked at it.
Yeah, definitely.
So
from a kind of practical point of view, I can use Famous to build something really cool, and it can be viewed by everybody?
Oh yeah. So very much in the WebKit world right now, which is great for mobile, unless you have a Windows phone. So okay, I should say something about IE. So I think for the most part, IE is good to go on this. They're just missing one super important thing, which is Preserve 3D, which is I think it's a CSS property that IE is not doing. But I think that it's certainly on like their next of things to do, because so I think that I think that'll fix itself relatively. I don't think it's like, IE8 is one of these like horrible things that sticks around forever because of XP. I think in the mobile world we're not dealing with that anymore. So I think that the manufacturers and the OSs are updating fast enough where you don't get stuck forever. But yeah, it's very much like Chrome and Safari. In my experience, it's the fastest on Safari. Safari seems to do the best job at rendering the 3D. Chrome seems to like cut a bunch of corners, and there's like bugs that show up as a result of that. Some like if you have two surfaces that you rotate so they're back to back, like on the flipper, right? If they're on the same z-axis, they'll bleed into each other in Chrome. So you actually have to put one pixel back in Z, otherwise they'll bleed into each other. That's like a weird Chromism. Like they cut the corner on that somewhere, right? So I think that, but I mean, for the most part, they render well in both of those contexts. You were saying that it wasn't doing so hot in Firefox.
Event, just simple, but getting events at all.
In the Firefox,
yeah. Seem to be.
Yeah, I haven't. I don't know what's going on in Firefox. I don't develop in Firefox, sort of like. So I don't know.
Yeah, they say on the site it's not good.
It's not good. Well, there you go.
How's the touch support?
Yes, I wanted to. You can go to these URLs on your touch devices, and you can play with them. So there's a concept in Famous called sync, right? And sync is basically like, as you might think of, where you're getting your input from, right? So there's touch syncs and other kind of syncs, scroll syncs and things like that, right? And then you can subscribe to those syncs with the event system. And so I think, yeah, I mean, for the most part, everything that I've seen has been pretty responsive. It's still subject to the DOM. They're using the fast click polyfill, which reduces that like 300 millisecond delay for tapping. But it's like if you have like scroll view, for example, if you take a base scroll view, throw it on there, put like 10 items in it, and set the direction to left to right, it'll naturally fill up the screen, and you'll have like a swipeable slideshow, just like that, and it's like super responsive. So I've seen things like that. So I think it's pretty good with that. With the syncs, it's really cool. I had an idea. I wanted to get it done for this, but I couldn't. But I had this concept that, like the get user media API for JavaScript is sort of like WebRTC, where you can get like the video, getting the video and audio input from the machine, right? That's sort of a HTML5 thing. It's called get user media or request user media or something, right? If you took that and get the audio stream, and then create a sync with the audio stream, and then transform from that, you could sort of have an app that's responding to audio input, right? And I think you could very easily do that with Famous, because those pieces are set up well that way. Sadly, I don't have that demo. Sorry.
Suppose you had a single page app, and you wanted sort of a viewport that was running Famous,
yeah.
And the rest of it is not.
Yeah. So
would you just use a frame, or what would be the best way?
So, where's so this create context, you can just pass the ID of any element on the page, and it'll make that a Famous container. So it doesn't need to be the whole thing. Yeah.
Now, they mentioned that there can be performance issues if you're doing other stuff with the DOM.
Of course.
If you have them as sort of a container, and you're doing anything DOM-wise you might think was innocent in the past, like you said it earlier before, they're expecting smooth, high frame rate.
Yeah.
So they have a lot of caveats. If you do anything while you do that little move, like a thing you might think is innocent, like just remove a div,
Yeah.
it's going to be
Yeah,
gaps
and
glitches.
and a lot of things are hardware accelerated. The translates, those are hardware accelerated. Changing the height or width of a div is not hardware accelerated, and that will jack your performance real quick. So if you're like doing this with divs, right, you're gonna have performance problems. The other thing is if you set the opacity to 1 versus 0.99, that's gonna cause performance issues. Yeah, so when you fade things in, you want to be careful to go to 0.99 and not 1, which I did just now. But little things like that. I mean, like there's a lot of articles, like HTML5rocks.com is like a Paul Irish articles about performance. I would say if you're gonna be working with Famous and your goal is like total performance, understand what those caveats are, and in your design, think about not doing them. You don't want to hear that because it's like that's not what we're promised, but it's just the reality of the tool, right? Yeah. So.
But now taking it down a step, a lot of what apps are made today are very simple. You talked about earlier, you wouldn't need this for like a simple app like a login, but you might want a little bit of pizzazz in the UI,
Right.
Yeah.
with a little gravity, like a little effect like an iOS might have, that's subtle. We have trouble in HTML5. Because that DOM only has 3 or 4 elements, you've been told that, like what I did, just screwing around with it for a few minutes by hand when I first brought it up, is code everything, all the coordinates by hand. You don't need any tool, you don't need anything, you don't need backup. Make a few surfaces, put a login name, make the login come down, right?
Yeah.
You have to end up being a movie maker.
Yeah.
It's a challenge of animation. I think
Yeah.
for a lot of developers, at least that's my problem, it's not so much how to do it, it's what should I do? Like what UI cues would actually not just be goofy as opposed to actually helping someone understand what's going on.
So perfect example of that. So here comes this thing. I'm going to scroll these up, right? I'm going to send this back. Now this whole thing is a single page and it's a scene, right? So my bad code, I'm not putting this away properly. Now watch what happens when I try to come back to this, right? Hold up. This guy here. This thing is still there in the back down there, right? Because I tried to hide it, but I didn't do a good enough job like keeping it off the side. It's a perfect example of like being a movie maker. Like you gotta, it's still responding to scrolling and
The
whatnot.
back of the flip
That's-
still.
Yeah.
That's what I was talking about when I came in the first place, just this particular bug. So, try this. Yeah, just like,
So does that go back to your point that you don't kill that out of the DOM, you just kind of hide it?
Yeah, like in the beginning of this.
It's still not on the shelf.
Yeah, I mean, all these things, everything is already rendered, like at this point. All those things are already there, right? And then it's just listening to About Us, and it's taking, so this view has a translate, which is pushing it down. It's listening to the event router and moving the translate up, and up comes the matrix, right? And then when you scroll, it's obviously, that initial point of pushing it down isn't good enough anymore. So I would have to go in there and sort of do a better job of putting it someplace better. When it's off screen.
Can you stop it from listening to like scroll events and stuff like that, or like literally as you use the entire app, this thing is still listening to all the scroll events that happen?
So this particular scroll view is like a sort of blunt for it. I'm piping from the engine, so any event that's happening on the engine level, which is like the top level, is being piped to the scroll view. But certainly you can pipe from a view or some other place like that, and so you wouldn't have that problem. But
So you're saying that technically speaking, when you push that off screen, it's still going to react to the scroll commands?
Yep.
So how would you have 2 different scroll views?
you wouldn't pipe from the engine.
There you go.
Yeah.
Pipe from the engine.
Be flexible.
That's one thing I would say about it, it's flexible. But then you got a white piece of paper to challenge the test. I mean, that's a problem I have. You start to imagine what you can do, but you gotta, and that's why I think movie maker is probably the best analogy.
Yeah.
You put your used to, you're more of a brochure creator with CSS. You go to Famous, you're more of a movie maker. Even if you're not animating, you're animating.
Yep.
It's really a stage.
It is, and it's a great thing to say because, like, remember, request animation frame and those transform frames, so it's constantly reacting to, and it's constantly updating itself. So it's absolutely never static. There's a great JavaScript library out there called Bacon.js. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's ridiculous.
Goes with everything, right?
Right, yeah. So, and it's exactly the point. So Bacon.js is a reactive event stream library right? Where you like create an event stream on the H1 tag, and then everything is like responding to any, what's going on. So it's the same idea. It's like these apps are becoming more and more live and responding to the current state.
Was it IE 11 only, or going back a little bit?
I don't know what would happen if you were to. I have a VM, I have IE on that. I don't know.
I'll pull it up.
Yeah, I don't know what's it going to do in IE.
Okay, I'm just curious.
Yeah, probably nothing good.
Yeah.
We're in a corporate environment.
I just have customers, and I can't dictate their browser.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in the mobile space you're a little bit like, if you're building like a hybrid app, or you're building specifically for mobile, I think you're a little bit safer. We were gonna, my company was gonna use Famous to rebuild its website, its marketing website, and I think sort of in that context you could probably do that, because you could render something for IE, just some like whatever HTML, but for potential clients and potential hires, they're probably gonna like be savvy enough, come in Chrome, maybe you can like give them a hint in the other browser, like, hey, and so there's a little bit there, but certainly like if you're building an enterprise app, I think you're a little bit a ways away with this, certainly. Yeah.
Is there a decent like modernizer or something test that'll tell you like now you're safe to use, like the browser's compliant enough to use Famous?
So all Famous is using is Matrix 3D and Request Animation Frame, right? So I think those two things, if you're going to like cannot use or whatever, I think paying attention to those things as they get into the green light, because other than that, it's just multiplying matrices and applying them to divs. It's not, yeah. So Matrix 3D and Request Animation Frame, yeah.
But now, I guess one question I had is, and I was getting a sense of this when I first logged in, but it's a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
They give you the scale thing, there's quite a bit there. They actually give you, it's a really nice project. Essentially, when you're done and you want to actually look at it, it has to compile it to what finally goes out to the client.
Oh, well, so it comes, the Yeoman generator generates with a grunt scaffold, and grunt, right now I'm running grunts, or here I'm running grunt serve, which is just like serving everything locally. If you run, once you get the Yeoman generator, if you run grunt without the word serve, it'll run the optimizer, push all the JavaScript down, and just give you HTML with one JavaScript file, one CSS file, which is like pretty hard for the course. It's not like compiling anything; it's just squishing JavaScript.
I mean, essentially, you could think of that as a runtime environment, right? What Famous really is, at the end of the day, is a runtime environment that then runs your project.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, but
all those animate frames, you're not programming that as part of their library. They're handling all of these transforms, all this. It's like a runtime program. Your actual solution is their server running with your code driving it. Right?
No.
It's their framework.
Yeah, it's just JavaScript.
Yeah, but I mean, it's when you deploy a Famous project,
yeah,
it essentially is a JavaScript program that is Famous running that's using your data sort of as the model.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
But you can step out of that. I mean, it's not a runtime in the sense that I don't think that's a perfect model for that.
But
Yeah.
you're not, to your point, you're not writing actual HTML at any point.
Oh, okay. Not in the Famous API. I mean, like those surfaces have that content property. You can pass in a whole web page into there.
Okay.
Whatever. It's just like a string, right? Yeah. So
I guess I meant runtime that they're looping, constantly doing stuff based on all these different properties and models you have to render it for you. You can't stop that. That's runtime.
no, you can't stop
It's a
that.
runtime
Yeah.
engine, sort of speaking.
Okay.
It's got
the
a
same
model.
argument for JavaScript in the first place. Timer's always running.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What he's saying is because they've hooked everything to animation frame, it's an engine, and I think that's a good.
I guess it's because it goes back to the caveat that if you're running this show, you're on the show. Be careful what else you do.
Yeah.
You're really going into the Famous land. And even if you try to do Famous in a div, it's on another page. I think their caveat was really well said, which is that's fine, but this is still one application. If you do anything with the DOM, you're going to affect us.
Yeah.
The runtime engine is going to be screwed up.
Yep, definitely.
Which isn't necessarily a problem. I mean, I was kind of envisioning some things where you might have certain aspects of your, even if it's a fairly business-centric app, you might want some places that have more of a sense of aesthetic where even if it's a list, you're manually logging in, and then you might go to other places. Like even if it's a 2-page, 3-page app model, one of those pages can be very famous.
Yeah, what we were thinking was
Nothing.
like,
They can still integrate pretty well because you have some of the animation capabilities to normal CSS and JavaScript, and if you intertwine some of those cues with a famous page, I think you can get by.
what we were thinking just like throwing particles up as a background for a page, right? Like super low transparency, right? Like a live background on the phone or something. Like we have a web page with like, you know, some particles back there that are kind of like reacting to the mouse. Like that's a nice little aesthetic touch. That's, you know, running, you know, yeah.
That's a little bit like the animated flame of Times Gone By, to a degree. But it's a good way to get up to speed with famous.
Yeah.
But what I'm thinking about is this. Here's a great example. Let's take the visual thesaurus, right? Where you've got the gravity type of fields for words that are related by their distances.
Yeah.
It's kind of like what E3 or whatever does.
D3.
Yeah. But Famous now lets you essentially have that same power in any kind of way you want, essentially. And they have a physics model. That's all that thing is doing, right?
Yep.
So if you want to do it, like you want to help your user wants to manage the information in a way that's not just a freaking list.
Yep.
It's related by space now. They sort of, like I think the biggest thing that's been missing in when they say the mobile is HTML5 is not good. I don't agree with that personally. I think it's great for what it's intended for. I don't think it was intended to make this. I don't think that was the goal of HTML5. So if you look at that need to really want to bring in what I would say this is driving is what kind of the Steve Jobs approach of making the thing feel real. When you scroll through a list on your iPhone,
Absolutely. I mean, that's. I mean,
you can't get
yeah.
that from
I mean,
us.
yeah. Certainly.
You get that from Famous.
Yeah, certainly. Physics is what's going to do that. Yeah. I mean, you want things to be tactile. Yeah.
Even the scroll list alone, just take one example.
Yeah.
You can't do that easily in HTML5 JavaScript without Famous. To get that smooth gravity, which
Not
slows down gravity.
not in a browser with a mouse wheel.
No, that's a big thing to me. I mean,
Yeah.
all of a sudden you can start getting some of these subtle effects. It's not like changing the world and making it living particles, but I'm talking this makes your application one level more like a native thing.
It's a quality thing, right?
Yeah.
It's user experience quality.
So what's the sort of third-party ecosystem look like at this point? I mean, compared to say like D3 where you've got a bazillion.
Well, I mean, that guy built the Angular plugin. I think that's pretty spectacular. You know, I haven't messed with. I mean, I've worked with Angular, but I haven't done any famous Angular. But I think that you end up with, from what very little I know of it, you end up with directives for surfaces and modifiers and things like that. So you can just sort of like, you know, this is a modifier and here's a surface, and you have the like in HTML. Which I understand why the CEO of Famous would sort of object to that. You know.
I was asking more about, you know, libraries of different effects and components.
So yeah, I mean, they're that's their hope. They've open sourced the project. I don't know. I mean, certainly like jQuery is sort of like the holy grail of these libraries, right? There's a million plugins and it's super well supported and all that. I think that their hope is that they understand that their core team can't write every plugin imaginable, right? I think they're doing their best to make it accessible that way. Like, look, you can make a Lightbox widget, you know, or some sort of like plugin gone past, you know, and maybe that'll sort of backfill in some developers, you know, those sort of like niceties. Yeah, I haven't seen. I think to the question, I haven't seen a whole lot of libraries out there. You know, I mean, we were going to throw Event Router up there because we think it's something that's sort of like useful. You know, like here's a backbone router that emits events and famous. Like you could probably use that. You know, so yeah, I think the community is sort of out there. You know, it's only been what 6 months since they released the public beta, so you know.
You see one of the examples I mentioned earlier. Someone created in Famous a version of that new Facebook paper.
Yeah.
And I think that was a great example because that's what Famous does so well. This scaling image, when you swipe up and it pulls the image full screen. Just there was a few lines. What was great, kind of like the example you gave earlier. It's not so much of how impressive and nice it is. It's how little code it took. And how much when you do what Famous does well, you don't try to reinvent the web with Famous.
Yep.
The old way.
Yeah.
And I see them doing a lot. I mean, I guess you have to. Adoption is important. But I think at some level, if you realize most apps aren't 500 DOM elements doing a million different things at once. A lot of things are fairly simple.
Yep.
If you look at your average, even your Google Calendar does not have a lot of elements. You know, when you start
Maybe not
looking at
your
breaking, when you start breaking it down, you can do a lot with a little. I think that should be more of the, when I think what I want to do with Famous, it's more like few surfaces doing a few elegant things can really take people's breath away and add that sense of personalization to a boring, simple process of logging in, let's say.
Yeah.
Or you like, I think your menu example is good too.
Yeah.
You have to have menus. It's a fact of life. You have to pick 1 of 5 pages. You can't see everything at once.
Yeah.
Well, at least if you do it in a way that there's context.
Yeah.
Like, I like the one that Global Zoom or whatever.
Global Transform.
I think that was very impressive. I think that's yet to be tapped. Situational awareness, so users doesn't feel like your site is 5,000 unconnected random orbs. I feel like when I go over here, it's actually over here. I think I think people will figure out how to use that in a way that's a little less arcadey, a little more subtle, and will have a lot of value. That's my prediction.
So this, yeah. You know, all the stuff we worked on.
So just to quickly wrap up, and then we can pester Byron with beer afterwards for more questions. There's questions about IE. I just happen to have the streaming this on the PC, so I open it up in IE, and Particles works, although once you get all of the little bubbles in there, it starts to slow down pretty quick.
But Particles does work in IE.
Particles works, and yeah, just slowed down. But for some reason, I just couldn't get to the scrolling to work.
The scrolling.
in the main app you've got running there.
This thing here.
Yeah, with the
The
arrow
scrolling.
keys. Yeah, but some of the others work too. Like I could go back and forward with the canvas and the OK Go and all those. So it was functional, but not as performant for sure.
Yeah, this one's funny. So each one of these surfaces is at a different place in Z, but it has been changed in scale to make it look like they're the same size. See the OK Go video that recently came out? So I call it OK Go menu. And so like it sort of like when you go to these
When you
things,
zoom in, you can see it.
you see that perspective is lost.
The first top left when you went,
Yeah.
you can see the. Top
All of a sudden,
middle.
like these things aren't flat at all. Yeah, like you tricked me. Yeah. But I think that's a big thing. It's a big thing. You get somebody with that though. You know, they're like, you know, this is not what I expected. You know, and I think that's very powerful. Yeah.
All right, well, thanks everybody.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you, Byron.
Yeah.
Any wave goodbye to the camera and all the viewers.
Bye, Internet.